Hello everyone, this is your host and you're watching this channel. Skepticism is an interesting phenomenon which has existed for a long time. It gets a lot of bad press. In fact, it seems that we live in an age of skeptics and cynics. It's as if skepticism has become synonymous with negativity or pessimism. But skepticism isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to approach the subject by answering 3 questions. First, what is skepticism? Second, why should we be skeptical? And third, what are the limits of skepticism? This will lead us to a discussion of the difference between skepticism and cynicism. So let's begin. What is skepticism? Well, basically it's a way of looking at things with a critical eye, of not taking anything for granted and always asking for evidence before forming an opinion. That's what the word means literally. Skeptical comes from the Greek word skepsis, which means inquiry or investigation. A skeptic is therefore someone who investigates before taking a stand. Of course, we all do that to some extent. We all weigh up different options when making decisions. But there are people who do it systematically and thoroughly in every area of their lives. These are people who don't readily accept what they're told. They ask questions, look for facts, try to find loopholes and alternative explanations. They don't like to be taken for granted, and that can be irritating and even infuriating. There are many ways to be skeptical, though. Someone might be skeptical about politics, history, science, religion, psychology, business, or any other human endeavor. In fact, one could be skeptical about skepticism itself. Skepticism is usually associated with a particular field of study, such as medical skepticism, historical skepticism, or skepticism about extrasensory perception. Medical skeptics question dubious medical claims. Historical skeptics challenge historical narratives. And skeptics of ESP investigate paranormal claims and try to explain them in more conventional terms. It's worth noting that skepticism is sometimes called healthy skepticism to distinguish it from cynicism, which is generally seen as a negative and destructive attitude. So why should we be skeptical? Well, because as the saying goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claims that go against common sense or established facts need extra scrutiny. For example, I wouldn't believe someone who claimed that he had met Jesus Christ unless he provided convincing evidence, such as reliable eyewitness testimony from more than just him. Now, I know that such claims are usually based on personal experience and that is often considered to be the best kind of evidence. But in this case, I would still want to hear from other people who saw Jesus too, because I have no reason to think that personal experiences are always reliable. You see, it's very easy to convince yourself of something without actually providing evidence for it. And we all do it all the time. Now, I can hear some people saying, how can you possibly claim that we all do that all the time? Surely that's just an assertion, and it is, but here's my evidence. Whenever you have an opinion about something, ask yourself how you arrived at that opinion. I lines bet that in most cases you won't be able to identify any specific evidence that led you to that opinion. Chances are it was just something you picked up somewhere along the line and accepted without ever questioning it. Perhaps it was something you read, heard or saw, or maybe someone told you. The point is that in most cases, our opinions are based on other people's opinions. We don't question these opinions because we trust the sources. We tend to assume that if someone else said it, then it must be true. And that's not necessarily the case. Let me illustrate what I mean. Imagine that 100 people were asked how they knew that the Earth is round. I'd be surprised if even one person could name a specific piece of evidence that convinced them. Most people will say something like, well, everyone knows the Earth is round, but that doesn't make sense. Just because everyone thinks the Earth is round doesn't mean that it's actually round. It merely means that most people believe it to be round. The truth is that only a tiny fraction of the population knows that the Earth is round. They've actually looked at the evidence, thought it through, and formed an opinion. Most of us never do this, we just accept what other people tell us. And that's why it's so important to be skeptical. If you stop believing everything you're told, you'll stop accepting things uncritically and you'll start thinking for yourself. But isn't that what skeptics do? Well, yes, but that's not the whole story. To properly understand what skeptics do, it's important to remember that they're not necessarily people who have no opinions. It's easy to get confused on this point because skeptics are often portrayed in the media as people who question everything. But in reality, most skeptics take a stand on most things. They just happen to be particularly thorough about the way they form their opinions. So rather than being people who have no opinions, skeptics are people who have strong opinions about the importance of having opinions. So where does that leave us? If we should be skeptical because most of us just accept what other people say without thinking for ourselves, and if skeptics are simply people who think things through and form opinions based on the available evidence, then how is it that we end up with so many different opinions? How come that skeptics don't all agree with each other? Well, that's because skepticism isn't just about thinking things through. It's also about thinking of alternative explanations. A skeptic doesn't just consider a claim and decide whether or not he believes it. He considers a claim and tries to come up with reasons why it might be false. For example, when a psychic claims to be able to communicate with the dead, a skeptic doesn't just ask for evidence for that claim. He also thinks of alternative explanations for the alleged psychic experiences. He considers the possibility that they could have been caused by fraud, coincidence, wishful thinking, or some other mundane factor. This is an important part of the process because it helps to prevent biases from getting in the way of the search for truth. If you start out by assuming that something is true, you lines ignore evidence that contradicts your expectations and jump to conclusions that are unsupported by the facts. A good skeptic doesn't suffer from this problem because he's always looking for alternative explanations. So if skepticism is a good thing, why are we surrounded by skeptics? Well, because it works. Skepticism works because it forces us to be precise and systematic in our thinking. It makes us look for evidence and alternative explanations. It encourages us to keep an open mind and to reconsider our opinions when confronted with new information. In short, skepticism is a powerful tool for finding the truth. However, as with any tool, it can be used for good or for evil. Healthy skepticism is a good thing because it helps us to think critically and to evaluate claims objectively. Unhealthy skepticism, on the other hand, can be a bad thing because it can lead to cynicism. A cynic is someone who has lost faith in everything. He's someone who rejects all claims out of hand without ever considering the evidence. In other words, a cynic is someone who refuses to think for himself. Healthy skepticism is characterized by an attitude of doubt, whereas cynicism is characterized by an attitude of disgust. A skeptic asks for evidence before forming an opinion, but a cynic dismisses all claims as attempts to manipulate him. A skeptic considers alternative explanations for a phenomenon, but a cynic assumes that there is always some ulterior motive behind people's statements. In short, a skeptic is someone who is open-minded and willing to change his opinion when presented with new evidence. A cynic is someone who is close-minded and refuses to believe anything. So while it's important to be skeptical in order to protect ourselves from being taken advantage of, it's also important not to let our skepticism turn into cynicism. That's all for now. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and remember, don't just stand there wondering if there's intelligent life out there. Be the intelligent life that you're looking for.